Crystal chandelier above cast harsh shadows across the marble foyer, as Kayla Martinez stood dripping wet from the sudden downpour, her delivery uniform clinging uncomfortably to her 5-month pregnant belly. Margaret Whitmore, draped in a silk evening gown worth more than Kayla's annual salary, looked down at her with the kind of disgust usually reserved for something scraped off expensive shoes. The billionaire matriarch had just thrown a glass of champagne directly at Kayla's face, the liquid now staining her work shirt and mixing with rainwater on the pristine Italian marble floor. The incident had started innocently enough. Kayla had been making her evening deliveries when she'd spotted Ethan's BMW parked outside the Whitmore estate. Her heart had leaped with excitement. She hadn't seen her boyfriend in 3 days, due to his mother's increasingly aggressive attempts to keep them apart. The security guard, recognizing her from previous visits, had let her through the gates. She'd planned to surprise Ethan with the ultrasound photos tucked safely in her jacket pocket, the first clear images of their daughter that she'd received that morning. Instead, she'd walked into what appeared to be an intimate family dinner. Margaret had been entertaining the Ashfords, another prominent wealthy family, along with their daughter Victoria, a statuesque blonde who'd been positioned strategically next to Ethan at the dining table. The sight had sent a chill through Kayla that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. Margaret's plan had been transparent: replace the pregnant delivery girl with someone more suitable for the Whitmore legacy. The confrontation had erupted immediately. Margaret hadn't even allowed Kayla to speak before launching into a verbal assault that left the entire room in stunned silence. She'd called Kayla a gold digger, a trap setter, and worse. The champagne throw had been the culmination, designed to humiliate Kayla in front of the assembled guests and send a clear message about her place in their world. Ethan had rushed to Kayla's side, his face pale with shock and anger at his mother's behavior. But Margaret had already achieved her goal. The damage was visible in every pair of eyes in that room. The pity, the superiority, the confirmation of their worst assumptions about the woman carrying a Whitmore heir. Kayla could feel their judgment like physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. The Ashfords had excused themselves quickly, Victoria shooting sympathetic glances toward Margaret as if consoling her for having to deal with such an unpleasant situation. The staff had appeared with towels and cleaning supplies, their eyes carefully averted from the family drama unfolding in their workplace. Even they seemed to understand the hierarchy at play. The billionaire's comfort mattered more than the delivery girl's dignity. Margaret's voice had been ice cold as she'd addressed Kayla directly for the first time that evening. She'd made it clear that no amount of pregnancy or emotional manipulation would secure Kayla a place in their family. The Whitmore name had been built over generations, she'd declared, and she wouldn't allow it to be tarnished by someone who delivered Chinese food for a living. Kayla's hands had instinctively moved to protect her belly as Margaret's words cut deeper than the physical humiliation. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about her daughter's future, about the kind of world she would grow up in if her grandmother's prejudices went unchallenged. The baby had responded to her stress with a series of strong kicks. As if already preparing to fight the battles ahead, Ethan had tried to defend her, his voice shaking with anger as he'd confronted his mother about her behavior. But Margaret had dismissed his protests with the casual wave of someone who'd never been denied anything in her life. She'd reminded him of his responsibilities to the family business, to their social standing, to everything except his own happiness and the woman he claimed to love. The evening had ended with Kayla fleeing into the storm, her dignity in tatters, but her resolve beginning to crystallize. As she'd driven away in her beat-up delivery car, windshield wipers struggling against the rain, she'd made a silent promise to her unborn daughter. No one, not even a billionaire matriarch, would decide their worth for them. The next morning had brought a continuation of her regular delivery schedule, But everything felt different now. Each house she visited, each customer interaction, seemed to highlight the vast gulf between her world and Ethan's. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Here she was, climbing stairs with packages while 5 months pregnant, earning barely enough to cover her own expenses, let alone prepare for a baby. Yet something had shifted inside her after the previous night's humiliation. Margaret Whitmore had underestimated her, had assumed that shame and social pressure would be enough to drive her away. The billionaire had seen only the uniform, the economic status, the obvious vulnerability of a pregnant woman with limited resources. She'd failed to see the steel beneath the surface, the intelligence behind the supposed desperation, and the growing determination that came from having everything to lose. The harassment had started subtly, as these things often do among the wealthy elite. Kayla first noticed it during her delivery routes 3 days after the champagne incident. Customers who'd previously been friendly, even generous with tips, suddenly became distant and occasionally hostile. Mrs. Henderson, who'd always invited her in for water and asked about her pregnancy, had barely opened the door wide enough to accept her package. The woman's eyes had been apologetic but firm. Clearly, word had spread through their social networks about the inappropriate delivery girl who'd dared to embarrass Margaret Whitmore. The economic pressure had intensified rapidly. 2 of her regular commercial clients had suddenly terminated their delivery contracts, citing budget cuts that somehow only affected her services. Her supervisor at the delivery company had called her into his office with uncomfortable questions about her professional conduct, referencing mysterious complaints that had been filed against her performance. The message was becoming clear. Margaret Whitmore's influence extended far beyond her mansion's marble walls. Kayla had tried to discuss the situation with Ethan during one of their increasingly rare meetings. But even those conversations had become strained. He'd been receiving pressure from multiple directions, his mother's daily ultimatums, the family business partners expressing concerns about his judgment, and the social circle that had been his entire world since childhood. The weight of choosing between his family's approval and his pregnant girlfriend was visibly wearing on him. Margaret's strategy had been becoming more sophisticated as well. She'd begun appearing at locations where Kayla worked, not to confront her directly, but to make her presence known. The billionaire would arrive at restaurants just as Kayla was making deliveries, creating awkward situations where staff members were forced to choose between treating their regular delivery person normally or acknowledging the powerful customer who clearly disapproved of her presence. The psychological warfare had extended to Kayla's living situation as well. Her landlord had received anonymous reports about noise complaints and lease violations that mysteriously coincided with Margaret's campaign. The aging building manager had been apologetic, but clear. He couldn't afford to lose other tenants over whatever drama she'd gotten herself involved in with important people. During her medical appointments, Kayla had started noticing strange coincidences as well. Other patients would sometimes mention hearing about her situation, referencing details that only someone with significant resources and connections could have discovered. The violation of her privacy had been almost as disturbing as the direct confrontations, suggesting that Margaret's reach extended into areas where a pregnant woman should feel safe and protected. Ethan's attempts to shield her from his mother's campaign had only highlighted how limited his power actually was within the family structure. Despite his position as heir to the Whitmore empire, he'd found himself increasingly isolated from decision-making processes. Margaret had begun excluding him from important business meetings, reminding him that his inheritance depended on his willingness to prioritize family reputation over personal desires. The stress had begun affecting Kayla's health in ways that concerned her doctor. Her blood pressure had been elevated during recent checkups, and the baby's movements had become more agitated. The physician had recommended reducing her work hours and avoiding stressful situations. Advice that seemed impossible to follow when her primary source of income was being systematically undermined and her emotional well-being was under constant attack. Local media attention had started developing as well, though nothing overt enough to be traced directly back to Margaret's influence. Social media posts had begun appearing about the challenges facing working mothers, featuring photos that looked suspiciously like they'd been taken during Kayla's delivery routes. The coverage was subtle, but pointed, painting her as someone seeking sympathy and financial advantage rather than simply trying to support herself and her unborn child. Sleep had become increasingly elusive as Kayla found herself analyzing every interaction, every changed attitude, every small indication that Margaret's campaign was affecting her life in new ways. The isolation was perhaps the worst part, feeling like she was fighting a battle where the rules kept changing and her opponent had unlimited resources and decades of experience in social manipulation. Her savings account, never substantial to begin with, had begun dwindling rapidly as work opportunities disappeared and medical expenses increased. The practical reality of supporting herself while pregnant had always been challenging. But Margaret's interference was transforming a difficult situation into a potentially desperate one. Each day brought new evidence that the billionaire matriarch was prepared to use every tool at her disposal to remove Kayla from her son's life. The most painful aspect had been watching Ethan struggle with the impossible position his mother had created for him. His love for Kayla was genuine, but his understanding of how to fight against his family's power structure was limited. He'd grown up in a world where money and influence solved problems, not created them for the people you cared about. The idea that his mother would target a pregnant woman so systematically seemed to genuinely shock him. Despite knowing her ruthless reputation in business, yet beneath the stress and fear, something else had been growing in Kayla's mind. Each attack, each attempt to diminish her worth, had been revealing something about Margaret Whitmore that the billionaire probably hadn't intended to show. The desperation behind the campaign suggested vulnerability, as if the powerful matriarch was actually afraid of what Kayla represented. Afraid enough to risk her own reputation by targeting someone so obviously defenseless. That fear implied that Kayla possessed something that Margaret considered genuinely threatening, even if she hadn't figured out what that was yet. The call had come at 6 a.m, jarring Kayla from the first peaceful sleep she'd managed in weeks. Margaret Whitmore's voice on the phone had been crisp and businesslike, as if she were scheduling a routine appointment rather than delivering what would essentially be a declaration of war. The billionaire had requested a meeting at her downtown office building, emphasizing that Kayla's attendance would be in everyone's best interest, especially her unborn child's. The 40-story Whitmore Industries building had been intimidating enough from the street, its glass and steel facade reflecting the morning sun like a fortress designed to keep ordinary people at bay. The elevator ride to the top floor had felt endless, each ascending floor marking another level of distance from the world where Kayla felt comfortable and capable. By the time she'd reached Margaret's executive suite, her hands had been trembling slightly, though whether from nerves or pregnancy hormones, she couldn't tell. Margaret's office had been designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city, while expensive artwork and awards covered the walls like trophies from conquered territories. The desk itself had been massive, positioned strategically so that visitors were forced to look up at the woman who controlled one of the largest family fortunes in the country. The conversation had started with false pleasantries that fooled no one. Margaret had inquired about Kayla's health and the baby's development with the kind of clinical interest a scientist might show toward lab specimens. The underlying message had been clear. She'd done her research and knew exactly how vulnerable Kayla's position really was. Then had come the offer that was really an ultimatum disguised as generosity. Margaret had produced a leather portfolio containing documents that would have solved all of Kayla's immediate financial problems and secured her future comfort. A trust fund for the baby, a house in a good neighborhood, medical coverage, and a substantial monthly allowance that would eliminate any need for her to work during pregnancy or beyond. The catch, of course, had been that accepting the money would require signing agreements that would effectively remove her from Ethan's life permanently. The legal documents had been thorough and merciless. In exchange for financial security, Kayla would agree to relocate to another state, have no contact with Ethan beyond what was absolutely necessary for co-parenting, and never speak publicly about their relationship or the Whitmore family. The child would bear the Whitmore name and receive every advantage that wealth could provide. But Kayla herself would essentially disappear from their social circle entirely. Margaret had presented the offer with the kind of confidence that suggested she'd never had anyone refuse her terms before. The billionaire had clearly expected Kayla to jump at the chance to escape her current struggles and provide for her daughter's future. The amount of money involved had been genuinely staggering, more than Kayla could expect to earn in several lifetimes of delivery work. Yet, as Margaret had detailed the terms, something had crystallized in Kayla's mind that went beyond simple pride or stubbornness. The offer had revealed the true extent of Margaret's desperation to remove her from Ethan's life. The willingness to pay such enormous sums suggested that the billionaire saw Kayla as more than just an unsuitable girlfriend. She saw her as a genuine threat to something important. The meeting had been interrupted by Ethan's unexpected arrival. He'd somehow learned about the meeting and had rushed to the office. His face flushed with anger and disbelief that his mother would attempt such direct manipulation. The confrontation between mother and son had been explosive. With decades of complicated family dynamics suddenly exposed in harsh detail, Margaret had remained calm throughout Ethan's outburst, responding to his accusations with the kind of measured patience that suggested she'd anticipated this reaction. She'd reminded him of his responsibilities to the family business, the charitable foundations that depended on their reputation, and the hundreds of employees whose livelihoods were connected to maintaining their social standing. Every word had been calculated to highlight the selfishness of choosing personal happiness over broader obligations. The emotional manipulation had been masterful and cruel. Margaret had produced photographs of family events, business celebrations, and charitable functions, using them to illustrate everything that Ethan would be walking away from if he continued his relationship with Kayla. She'd painted a picture of family disgrace, business partnerships dissolving, and social exile that would affect not just them but everyone connected to the Whitmore name. Ethan's response had been passionate, but increasingly desperate as he'd realized how thoroughly his mother had prepared for this confrontation. She'd had answers for every argument, counterpoints for every emotional appeal, and evidence to support her claims about the potential consequences of his choices. The young man who'd grown up with unlimited resources had found himself powerless against his mother's strategic preparation. The breaking point had come when Margaret had mentioned the baby's future directly. She'd expressed concerns about the kind of life a child could expect with a mother who had no education, no family wealth, and no social connections. The implication had been clear. Kayla would be choosing to limit their daughter's opportunities and condemn her to a lesser existence. Kayla had listened to the entire exchange with growing clarity about what was really at stake. This wasn't just about her relationship with Ethan or even about Margaret's social prejudices. This was about power, control, and the billionaire's absolute conviction that money and status were the only things that mattered in determining a person's worth or a child's potential. The meeting had ended with no resolution, but the lines had been clearly drawn. Margaret had given them 24 hours to consider her offer, emphasizing that the terms would only become less generous with time. The threat had been implicit but unmistakable. Refused the generous buyout and faced the full weight of her resources turned against them in a battle they couldn't hope to win. As Kayla had left the building, her mind had been racing with possibilities she'd never considered before. Margaret's desperation suggested vulnerability, but it also confirmed that the stakes were higher than she'd realized. The billionaire was willing to risk exposure and potential scandal rather than allow this relationship to continue. Which meant there was something about Kayla that represented a fundamental threat to everything Margaret had spent her life building. The elevator ride down had felt like descending back into her real world, but Kayla had no longer felt like the same person who'd arrived that morning. Margaret Whitmore had inadvertently revealed information that could change everything, if only Kayla could figure out how to use it. The retaliation had been swift and devastating. Within hours of their meeting, Kayla had discovered that her delivery company contract had been terminated effective immediately, with her supervisor citing performance issues that she knew had been fabricated. The timing had been too precise to be coincidental. Margaret had clearly prepared multiple contingency plans in case her buyout offer was refused. Her apartment building manager had appeared at her door that same evening with an eviction notice, claiming lease violations that included unauthorized business activities and disturbing other tenants. The accusations had been absurd, but legally sufficient to begin removal proceedings. Kayla had realized with growing horror that Margaret's influence extended into areas she'd never imagined, reaching people who had no obvious connection to the Whitmore empire. The medical harassment had been perhaps the cruelest aspect of Margaret's campaign. Kayla's health insurance had been mysteriously canceled due to reported employment status changes, leaving her with no coverage during the most critical phase of her pregnancy. Her doctor's office had received anonymous complaints about her payment history, creating administrative complications that interfered with routine prenatal care. Even her personal relationships had come under attack. Friends who'd known her for years had begun receiving mysterious phone calls asking questions about her character, her financial situation, and her relationship history. The invasion of privacy had been systematic and thorough, designed to isolate her from any support system that might help her resist Margaret's pressure. Ethan had tried to counter his mother's campaign, but his efforts had only revealed how limited his actual power was within the family structure. His attempt to use family funds to support Kayla had been blocked by Margaret's control over their financial accounts. His efforts to involve family lawyers had been neutralized by conflicts of interest that mysteriously prevented them from representing anyone opposing Margaret's interests. The psychological pressure had begun affecting Kayla's health in ways that her remaining medical coverage couldn't address. Sleep deprivation, stress-related complications, and anxiety about her daughter's future had created a downward spiral that threatened both their well-being. The irony hadn't been lost on her that Margaret's campaign to prove she was unfit to raise a Whitmore child was actually creating the conditions that might harm that child. Local media attention had intensified in ways that seemed designed to create maximum embarrassment. Paparazzi had begun following her daily routines, capturing unflattering photos of a pregnant woman struggling with unemployment and housing insecurity. The coverage had been carefully framed to suggest that she was seeking sympathy and financial advantage rather than simply trying to survive an orchestrated attack on her livelihood. Her savings had evaporated rapidly as she'd been forced to cover medical expenses, legal consultations, and basic living costs without any income. The practical reality of fighting a billionaire while pregnant and unemployed had become overwhelming. Each day had brought new evidence that Margaret possessed resources and influence that extended far beyond what most people could imagine or resist. The breaking point had come during a routine prenatal appointment that had turned into a nightmare of bureaucratic complications. Her pregnancy-related medical needs had been used against her as evidence of financial instability and inability to provide proper care for her child. Anonymous reports to social services had suggested that she was in an unfit living situation and potentially endangering her unborn daughter. The social worker who'd appeared at her apartment had been professional but clearly influenced by information that painted Kayla as unstable and seeking to exploit wealthy men for financial gain. The interview had been humiliating and invasive, with questions about her relationship, history, financial management, and emotional stability that seemed designed to confirm predetermined conclusions rather than assess her actual situation. Ethan's presence during the social services visit had only made things worse. His obvious wealth and family connections had highlighted the economic disparity between them. While his emotional distress had been interpreted as evidence of an unhealthy relationship dynamic, the social worker had recommended counseling and family mediation, services that Kayla could no longer afford, and that Margaret would undoubtedly manipulate to her advantage. The lowest point had come when Kayla had been forced to pawn her grandmother's engagement ring to pay for groceries and prenatal vitamins. The ring had been her only connection to family history. The only valuable thing she'd owned that represented love rather than mere survival necessity. Watching it disappear into a pawnshop display case had felt like losing the last piece of her identity that existed independent of this nightmare. That night, alone in her soon-to-be former apartment, Kayla had found herself seriously considering Margaret's offer for the first time. The alternative had seemed to be watching her daughter's health suffer while she struggled against forces beyond her control. The billionaire's promise of security and stability had begun to look less like a bribe and more like the only rational choice available. But, as she'd held the ultrasound photos of her daughter, something had shifted in her thinking. Margaret's desperation to remove her from Ethan's life suggested that the billionaire was afraid of something specific. The amount of resources being devoted to this campaign implied that Kayla represented a threat that went beyond simple social embarrassment or family reputation. The realization had been gradual but transformative. Margaret Whitmore, despite all her wealth and power, was acting like someone who was genuinely afraid. The question that had kept Kayla awake that night was simple, but potentially game-changing. What exactly was the billionaire matriarch so desperately trying to hide? And how could a pregnant delivery driver possibly threaten someone who seemed to have everything? The turning point had come from an unexpected source. While clearing out her locker at the delivery company, Kayla had overheard two office workers discussing a strange request they'd received. Someone had been asking detailed questions about her delivery routes, specifically which buildings she'd visited regularly and during what time periods. The inquiry had come through official channels, but the workers had found it odd that anyone would need such specific information about a terminated employee's work history. That conversation had triggered a memory that Kayla had initially dismissed as coincidence. During her months of delivering to downtown office buildings, she'd noticed patterns in the businesses that seemed to share certain characteristics: luxury car dealerships that rarely had customers, art galleries with expensive pieces but no visitors, consulting firms with prestigious addresses but minimal visible activity. At the time, she'd assumed it was simply how wealthy people conducted business differently from her world. The realization had hit her while reviewing her old delivery receipts, which she'd kept for tax purposes. The addresses formed a network of businesses that all shared common features. They were all registered to subsidiaries of companies that eventually traced back to Whitmore Industries or their business partners. More importantly, many of these locations had been receiving regular deliveries of documents that required signatures from specific individuals who were never present during business hours. Her delivery background had given her insights that most people wouldn't have access to. She'd learned to recognize the difference between legitimate businesses and those that existed primarily on paper. The Whitmore network included numerous locations that appeared to be conducting transactions without the usual signs of actual commerce: no customers, minimal staff, but consistent financial activity that required regular document transfers. Using public records available at the library, Kayla had begun mapping the connections between these businesses and their reported financial activities. The pattern that emerged had been startling: a sophisticated money laundering operation that moved funds through multiple shell companies before they disappeared into offshore accounts. The system had been elegant and nearly invisible, except to someone who'd spent months physically visiting the locations and observing their actual operations. Her pregnancy had actually provided unexpected advantages for this investigation. People tended to underestimate pregnant women, especially those in service jobs, treating them as essentially invisible while conducting business. She'd been present for conversations and witnessed document exchanges that would have been hidden from anyone the participants considered a potential threat. The breakthrough had come when she'd recognized one of the signatures on her old delivery receipts. Marcus Chun, listed as a business partner on numerous Whitmore subsidiary documents, had supposedly been conducting regular business at various locations throughout the city. However, Kayla had read his obituary in the newspaper 3 months earlier. Someone had been using a dead man's identity to authorize financial transactions worth millions of dollars. Research at the public library had revealed that Marcus Chun wasn't the only deceased individual whose identity was being used in the Whitmore financial network. At least 4 other people who'd died within the past 2 years were still listed as active participants in business transactions. The documentation was sophisticated enough to pass casual inspection, but the physical impossibility of dead people conducting business was undeniable once someone noticed the pattern. The most damaging discovery had been Margaret's personal involvement in the operation. As CEO of Whitmore Industries, she'd personally signed authorizations for many of the transactions that Kayla now knew were fraudulent. The billionaire's signature appeared on documents that moved money through the shell company network in ways that violated numerous financial regulations and tax laws. Kayla had realized that her months of delivery work had inadvertently made her a witness to federal crimes. More importantly, she'd inadvertently collected evidence that could expose the entire operation. Her delivery receipts, combined with public records and obituary notices, formed a paper trail that law enforcement could follow to unravel years of sophisticated financial fraud. The discovery had explained Margaret's desperate attempts to remove her from the family. The billionaire hadn't been protecting family reputation or social standing. She'd been protecting herself from someone who could destroy her freedom and fortune with a single phone call to the FBI. The campaign of harassment and intimidation had been designed to discredit Kayla before she could realize what she'd witnessed. Armed with this knowledge, Kayla had begun developing a strategy that went beyond simply surviving Margaret's attacks. The evidence she'd inadvertently collected was valuable enough to interest federal investigators, but it would also provide leverage for protecting herself and her daughter. Margaret Whitmore might be powerful enough to manipulate social services and local businesses, but she couldn't control federal law enforcement agencies. The process of organizing her evidence had been methodical and careful. Kayla had made copies of every relevant document, cross-referenced dates and locations, and prepared a comprehensive report that even non-experts could understand. She'd also taken steps to protect the evidence from tampering or theft, storing copies in multiple secure locations that Margaret couldn't access or influence. Her understanding of the delivery business had provided crucial insights into how the money laundering operation actually functioned. The shell companies had been using legitimate delivery services to transport documents and maintain the appearance of actual business activity. By tracking the patterns of these deliveries, Investigators would be able to map the entire financial network and identify all participants. The final piece of her strategy had involved reaching out to contacts within the delivery industry who could verify her account of the suspicious business activities she'd observed. These witnesses would be able to confirm that the Whitmore subsidiary locations had been conducting unusual operations that didn't match their supposed business purposes. As Kayla had prepared for the confrontation ahead, she'd felt a transformation that went beyond simple revenge or survival. Margaret Whitmore had underestimated her in every possible way, assuming that economic pressure and social intimidation would be sufficient to control someone from the working class. The billionaire had never considered that a delivery driver might possess the intelligence, observational skills, and determination necessary to uncover her carefully hidden crimes. The power dynamic between them was about to shift dramatically, and Margaret Whitmore was going to learn that attacking a pregnant woman had consequences she'd never anticipated. The meeting had been Kayla's idea this time, arranged through Ethan, who'd been surprised by her sudden request to speak with his mother again. Margaret had agreed with the confident assumption that Kayla had finally accepted the inevitable and was ready to negotiate her departure from their lives. The billionaire had expected to see a broken woman ready to accept whatever terms were offered, not someone who'd spent weeks building a case that could destroy everything she'd worked decades to build. The same intimidating office where Margaret had delivered her ultimatum had become the setting for a very different kind of conversation. This time, Kayla had entered with a briefcase containing meticulously organized evidence that transformed her from desperate victim into credible threat. The dynamic had shifted before either woman had spoken a word, visible in the way Margaret's confident posture had changed when she'd noticed Kayla's professional preparation. Kayla had begun by expressing gratitude for Margaret's previous offer, acknowledging the generous terms and the security it would have provided for her daughter's future. The billionaire had relaxed slightly, assuming that this conversation would proceed along expected lines toward capitulation and departure. That assumption had lasted exactly long enough for Kayla to produce her first piece of evidence, a delivery receipt signed by Marcus Chun 3 weeks after his documented death. The color had drained from Margaret's face as she'd recognized the implications immediately. The receipt represented more than just an administrative error. It was evidence of identity, fraud being used to facilitate major financial transactions. Margaret's attempt to dismiss it as a clerical mistake had fallen apart when Kayla had produced additional examples involving other deceased individuals whose identities were being used throughout the Whitmore subsidiary network. The conversation had shifted rapidly from negotiation to damage control as Margaret had realized the extent of what Kayla had discovered. The billionaire's confidence had evaporated as evidence mounted that her money laundering operation had been exposed by someone she'd dismissed as intellectually and socially inferior. Each document Kayla had produced had represented millions of dollars in fraudulent transactions that could trigger federal investigations. Margaret's attempts to explain away the evidence had become increasingly desperate as the full scope of her exposure had become clear. The shell companies, the falsified documents, the use of deceased identities. Each element of her sophisticated financial scheme had been documented by someone who'd been physically present at the locations where the crimes were being committed. The moment of complete reversal had come when Kayla had revealed that she'd already prepared a comprehensive report for federal investigators, including detailed maps of the money laundering network and witness statements from other delivery personnel who'd observed suspicious activities. Margaret's power and influence, which had seemed unlimited weeks earlier, had suddenly become irrelevant in the face of federal criminal charges. Kayla's demand had been simple and non-negotiable. Margaret would immediately cease all harassment and interference in her life, would publicly acknowledge her relationship with Ethan, and would provide a formal written apology for her behavior. In exchange, Kayla would give Margaret 24 hours to voluntarily disclose her financial irregularities to authorities before the evidence was submitted to federal investigators. The billionaire's response had been predictable, but futile. She'd attempted to use her usual tactics: threats, bribes, appeals to family loyalty, but each approach had fallen flat against someone who now held the power to destroy her completely. Margaret's wealth and social connections were meaningless against federal criminal law, and her reputation would be worthless from inside a prison cell. Ethan's arrival during the confrontation had added another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. His shock at learning about his mother's criminal activities had been genuine and devastating. The young man who'd grown up believing in his family's legitimate success had discovered that much of their wealth had been built on sophisticated fraud that could destroy countless lives. The family dynamic had completely inverted during that conversation. Margaret, who'd spent her life controlling every aspect of her son's existence, had found herself dependent on his decision about whether to support her against federal charges or stand with the woman carrying his child. The power structure that had defined their family for decades had collapsed in the space of a single afternoon. Kayla's transformation during that confrontation had been remarkable to witness. The frightened delivery driver who'd been humiliated with champagne had become someone who could calmly discuss federal money laundering statutes and their potential prison sentences. Margaret's attempts to intimidate her had been met with detailed explanations of RICO violations and asset forfeiture proceedings. The most devastating moment had come when Kayla had revealed that her evidence wasn't just about financial crimes. The harassment campaign against her had created additional legal exposure for Margaret, including civil rights violations, witness intimidation, and conspiracy charges that could compound her criminal liability. The billionaire's attempts to destroy Kayla had generated their own trail of evidence that federal prosecutors would find very interesting. Margaret's final attempt to regain control had involved threatening to destroy evidence and flee the country, but Kayla had anticipated this possibility as well. The copies of all documentation had been secured beyond Margaret's reach, and attempting to obstruct justice would only add more serious charges to an already overwhelming case. The confrontation had ended with Margaret facing a choice between voluntary cooperation and inevitable prosecution. Her empire of wealth and influence had been reduced to the simple question of whether she would take responsibility for her crimes or force federal agents to arrest her publicly. The woman who'd considered herself untouchable had discovered that criminal law was the one force her money couldn't control. As Kayla had gathered her evidence to leave, the power dynamic in that office had been completely reversed. Margaret Whitmore, who'd spent months systematically destroying a pregnant woman's life, had found herself begging for mercy from someone she'd dismissed as worthless. The delivery driver had become the one person who could determine the billionaire's future, and that future looked increasingly bleak. The 24 hours that followed had been transformative for everyone involved. Margaret had spent the time consulting with her most trusted legal advisors, all of whom had delivered the same sobering message. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and her only realistic option was to cooperate fully with federal investigators in hopes of receiving consideration for voluntary disclosure. The empire she'd spent decades building was about to face scrutiny that would likely result in massive fines, criminal charges, and the destruction of her family's reputation. The press conference had been carefully orchestrated to minimize damage while acknowledging the serious nature of the situation. Margaret had appeared before reporters and investigators to announce that Whitmore Industries was voluntarily cooperating with federal authorities regarding financial irregularities that had been discovered within their subsidiary network. She'd avoided admitting criminal intent while accepting responsibility for inadequate oversight that had allowed the illegal activities to continue. What had surprised everyone, including Kayla, was the genuine transformation that had occurred in Margaret's attitude during that crucial day. The billionaire had been forced to confront the reality that her prejudices and need for control had led her to target someone whose intelligence and observational skills far exceeded what she'd assumed based on economic status and education level. The humbling experience had been profound and apparently lasting. Ethan had played a crucial role in facilitating the reconciliation that followed. His decision to support Kayla throughout the crisis had forced his mother to choose between maintaining her prejudices and losing her son entirely. The prospect of being cut off from her family while facing federal charges had provided powerful motivation for reconsidering long-held beliefs about class, worth, and family loyalty. The private meeting between Kayla and Margaret that had occurred 3 days after the press conference had been unlike either woman had expected. Margaret had approached the conversation with genuine humility, acknowledging that her attempts to destroy Kayla had been motivated by fear and prejudice rather than legitimate concerns about family welfare. The apology had been comprehensive and apparently sincere, addressing both the personal attacks and the systemic harassment that had threatened Kayla's pregnancy and livelihood. More importantly, Margaret had demonstrated her commitment to change through concrete actions rather than just words. She'd established a trust fund for Kayla's daughter that was completely independent of any relationship requirements, ensuring the child's future regardless of family dynamics. She'd also created a foundation focused on supporting working mothers facing economic hardship, with Kayla serving as an advisor to ensure the programs addressed real needs rather than theoretical charity. The transformation in family dynamics had been equally dramatic. Margaret had begun including Kayla in family discussions and business decisions, recognizing that her background provided valuable perspectives that the billionaire's privileged circle often missed. The woman who'd been dismissed as a gold digger had become someone whose insights were actively sought and respected. Kayla's pregnancy had continued under much different circumstances than anyone had originally expected. With financial security assured and family support restored, she'd been able to focus on her health and prepare for motherhood without the constant stress of economic uncertainty. The baby's movements had become calmer and more regular as the anxiety that had characterized the middle months of pregnancy had finally subsided. The federal investigation had proceeded as expected, with Margaret's cooperation resulting in reduced charges and alternative sentencing that focused on restitution and community service rather than prison time. The Whitmore business empire had survived the scandal, though with significantly reduced assets and a new focus on legitimate operations under regulatory oversight. Perhaps the most significant change had been in how Margaret viewed people from different economic backgrounds. The experience of being outsmarted by someone she'd dismissed as inferior had forced her to reconsider assumptions she'd held throughout her privileged life. She'd begun actively seeking diverse perspectives in her business operations and charitable activities, recognizing that intelligence and insight weren't distributed according to wealth or social status. The birth of little Sophia 3 months later had sealed the family reconciliation in ways that no amount of negotiation could have achieved. Margaret's first sight of her granddaughter had reportedly moved her to tears, and her subsequent devotion to the child had been complete and unwavering. The billionaire who'd once tried to separate the baby from her mother had become one of Sophia's most protective and devoted advocates. Kayla's relationship with Ethan had emerged stronger from their ordeal, built on a foundation of mutual support during genuine adversity rather than the easier affection of unchallenged romance. His willingness to choose her over his mother's approval, combined with her strength in protecting their family's future, had created a partnership that could weather the complexities of their unusual family situation. The media attention that had initially been weaponized against Kayla had eventually turned positive as the true story emerged. Her transformation from persecuted delivery driver to federal witness to respected family member had captured public imagination and provided inspiration for other working women facing seemingly impossible challenges from powerful adversaries. Margaret's public acknowledgement of her prejudice and subsequent efforts to make amends had also resonated beyond their immediate situation. The billionaire's willingness to admit error and change fundamental attitudes had sparked conversations about class assumptions and economic privilege that extended far beyond their personal drama. As Sophia grew from infant to toddler, the unconventional family structure had proven more successful than anyone had anticipated. Margaret's resources combined with Kayla's practical wisdom and Ethan's genuine love had created an environment where the child could benefit from multiple perspectives and unlimited opportunities while remaining grounded in real-world understanding. The foundation Margaret had established in response to the crisis had grown into a significant force for supporting working mothers, with Kayla's involvement ensuring that programs addressed actual needs rather than wealthy assumptions about poverty. The organization had become a model for how privilege could be used constructively rather than defensively. Looking back, all three adults had recognized that the crisis had forced necessary growth that might never have occurred under easier circumstances. Margaret had been compelled to confront the limitations of her worldview. Ethan had learned to stand up for his own values. And Kayla had discovered strength and capabilities she'd never known she possessed. The story had become something of a legend in their social circle, demonstrating that intelligence, courage, and determination could triumph over wealth and influence when justice was genuinely at stake. More importantly, for the family involved, it had created a foundation of mutual respect that promised to provide Sophia with a childhood free from the prejudices and limitations that had almost destroyed her parents' relationship before she was even born. If you enjoyed this dramatic story of justice and family reconciliation, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of ordinary people overcoming extraordinary challenges through courage and determination.